Now, what is interesting is that at least in 1991, that is at the time of liberalization, still there were two large cities in the region, which is Kanpur and Lucknow. They were still two of the 10 largest cities. It was not so that the Hindi heartland started to decline immediately after independence and so forth. The Uttar Pradesh has about 17 or 18% of the population of India. It had two of the largest 10 cities. So it was kind of proportionate to the population in that sense. But now, obviously, even though this particular region, this region has a lot of population, there are no major cities. So there's been a vacuuming of the large cities. And what is very, very characteristic about this particular pattern is that all the poor districts of and Lok Sabha constituencies of India are kind of clustered in the exact same place where no cities, big cities are found. So there's obviously some sort of a correlation between the fact that whether or not a region can host growing prosperous cities like Bangalore and so forth, and whether or not the region has some level of economic prosperity. And you can see that Hindi heartland has very high levels of poverty even today. What is also very, very important to notice that if you look at the left side, that when you look across cities today in India, you find a very large disparity. So when it comes to economic development, now you cannot compare the states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, which are at the bottom of the per capita income of the states at around $1,000 US. And you cannot compare them to states like Karnataka, which are around 4 times more richer in terms of per capita income. And this is why these kinds of webinars become more relevant. Because when we talk about India's economic development, what we have to slowly understand and grapple with is that now we have multiple types of Indias at multiple levels of economic development. And the kind of things you need for states like UP, Bihar, and Jharkhand, and the Northeast, for that matter, is also extremely impoverished. Manipur, Assam, the prescriptions you need for those regions are very different from the prescriptions that states like Karnataka and Telangana and Tamil Nadu need at this moment. So that is something which makes this particular webinar relevant, because ultimately when we want to do economic development, we can't, even if we want to focus on regional issues, overall national development only happens when all the regions can get economically balanced. Otherwise, it leads to all sorts of problems. And hence, we wanted to focus on this particular region, because this particular region has this, is having similar kind of economic status at this moment. Now, what is particularly important here is to note that there are about 50 crore people who live in this particular region where there are no cities. And that is a very large number. It is almost 66% larger than the United States. It is almost the size of European Union. And these 5 states, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, MP, and UP, they make 50 crore people, but they still don't have one large city. And that is a very unnatural situation. It is also a very historically abnormal situation that such a situation has arrived. So on that note, I would like to pass on to Alok, given that he's from Allahabad, and Allahabad was an important city historically, and it was an important intellectual center in the early 20th century, and slowly it declined. So I wanted to know your thoughts on this.
As a person who is from Allahabad, the story that you just told us, it's really depressing, considering the fact that as late as 1991, Kanpur and Lucknow were figuring top 10 cities of India, and then suddenly there's vacuuming of big cities in Hindi heartland, UP in particular. It's really a very depressing story coming from Allahabad. Yeah, as a child growing up in Allahabad, we always had a very high opinion of that Allahabadi identity. Allahabad being a very important center, very important city, Allahabad University, Allahabad High Court, and certain historical association with the national movement. But compared to the rapid development of cities that we had in other parts of India, particularly southern India and western India. Allahabad did not catch up with the changing times. We failed to catch up, failed to run at the same pace. There might have been many reasons, but I don't know. As an economist, you would be able to see the larger picture in a more holistic way. Allahabad did come down in the ladder, and I think many factors would have contributed. Deindustrialization was one of them. Allahabad had an industrial area by the name Nani. Nani industrial area was a very important, a very prominent industrial area. In my own lifetime, I have seen deindustrialization of Nani. Around 1970s, that area was industrialized due to intensive public sector efforts. Indian Telephone Industries, Bharat Pumps and Compressors Limited, a lot of public sector companies set up their base in that area. But over a period of time, those industries either failed to expand or they were just wound up. It might be due to the fact that Dani industrial area was born due to public sector intervention, more on electoral consideration, Allahabad being an important political constituency. The growth of industrial cluster of Nani, in particular Allahabad, was not organically driven, so to say. So once that political will, once that political focus went away, deindustrialization had to be the logical consequence. So yeah, there was a deindustrialization, city did go down. Allahabad University lost its former prominence. The political calculations changed. So all these things led to relative decline of Allahabad as an important urban center of India.
Given that Allahabad is literally in the center and so close to Banaras of this particular region, isn't it kind of unnatural, given that in some sense, liberalization should have meant that people started to move in natural ways and set up new opportunities, etc., like the way it started to happen, for example, in Bangalore or Pune eventually, or Hyderabad. So isn't it unnatural that, 50 crore people are living in this region, they have the same culture pretty much, and they could not converge to even a single city of the region?
No, I don't know. Very difficult to think about the reasons, but actually in 19th century or prior to that, cities were primarily trading posts. In pre-industrial India, cities were trading, in my understanding, they were primarily trading posts. So the cities which were there located in important trade routes, or cities which are located in important and rich agriculturally productive hinterland, they had natural advantages. That is why you see a lot of cities in Doab area, Ganga Yamuna Doab area, which was a very fertile agricultural region, supported one of the most dense populations of the world. But over a period of time, industrialization took place in other parts of India. Services sector became prominent, and a market economy was brought into being around 1991. The culture that required, the institutions, the social beliefs, social practices, which require market economy to flourish, market interaction to flourish, somehow they were not abundant, or they were lacking in those parts of India that we are talking about, compared to southern India and western India. I think the institutions, both the institutions like government, institutions like courts, as well as social institutions like negative institutions like caste, sectarian identities, did contribute to the failure of this particular place to take advantage of market interactions and improve productivity.
Let's look at these particular issues one by one, that you point out: culture, institutions, capital, etc. But quickly, I mean, broadly speaking, given that there's been a flight out from the region, the obvious strategy that effectively governments have been trying lately is to kind of now start to attract all the capital and labor that they can find into the region. And there are initiatives focusing on universities, there are initiatives trying to boost certain kinds of regions, certain corridors of, the Ganges, Ganga River, etc. But obviously, just wishing that economic clusters get built, it doesn't really build them. For example, if you look at Calcutta, it's a good example of a city which is very, very prominent internationally for a very long time, but slowly it began to lose its significance, relatively speaking, to other parts of India, which highlights that just because you have a kind of, you want to attract investment, it doesn't mean that investment get attracted. So essentially, as you pointed out, there are kind of three things which get into the way for building good economic clusters. One is obviously institutions, as you talked about, law and order. Second is essentially doing business can be very hard in some regions, especially if telephones aren't there, or transport infrastructure isn't there, etc. So just transport, movement, all these are important things. And then thirdly, if a region doesn't have trust amongst communities, or if there is kind of caste-based, religion-based politics, these things also add to the difficulty of regions emerging as clusters. So given that you have spent considerable amount of time as working in the districts of Uttar Pradesh, can you share some of your own insights into how the administration or law and order works in the region, given that generally speaking, the whole region has a pretty bad name when it comes to law and order. And we also see that number of police per capita is also very low, for that matter, that there are very few police officers in the region. You can see over here that almost very less. And so how does it work? Why are they, if the law and order is so poor, why is the police force so little? If we increase the number of police officers per capita, would that make things better?
I'll try to go about from general to particular. It's a very difficult question. As you rightly said, it requires certain institutions to develop or certain institutions to improve. For economic development, we broadly understand capital, labor, technology, then hard infrastructure like roads, electricity, and then there's soft infrastructure like trust, law-abiding citizenry, sense of justice and sense of trust among each other. Well, UP is endowed with capital, with labor. At least the low skilled and unskilled labor is in huge abundance. UP is the net supplier of labor to other parts of the country. Regarding capital, UP is a capital deficient state, but then there are no significant capital inflow or outflow barriers between Gujarat or UP, or between Maharashtra or UP. I don't think why capital cannot flow from other parts of the country. The thing that might be inhibiting capital flow is poor institutions or poor infrastructure, roads, electricity, or as you said, law and order. The most important thing in soft infrastructure is law and order. Yeah, law and order in UP is bad compared to other states. There is much to be improved, but leaving it up to police force alone, increasing the capacity of the police force is very important. But we have to understand in the social milieu in which police force functions. Police is both a protector of the common man, but at times, under conditions which are far from ideal, police as an institution can also become a significant agent of oppression. So we need, if law and order has to be maintained, it has to be seen in more holistic focus. Police having greater capacity, police having greater accountability, criminal justice mechanism, the most important pillar is going to be courts. There should be well-functioning court system. And going beyond that, there should be law-abiding software built into the public psyche. And that law-abiding software builds in over a period of time when the law garners the trust of people. This is my understanding. Police reforms are very important. Police capacity building is important. But I think somehow, not just capacity building in terms of ability of police to go after the criminals, but also about the ability of the society to control the police behavior in a way which helps social systems to function well.
So in your own experience, do you have any examples that you can think of where you thought that, okay, the law and order could improve, or what you talked about, that can the broader society hold the police to account just as the police holds the society to account? So this relationship, do you have any anecdotes or thoughts of how kind of people go about doing such a thing?
Actually, anecdotes abound. All of us have heard anecdotes, and I have heard anecdotes on both sides of as a commoner, as a common citizen, as well as the part of administration, and they are really depressing. It is at times the practice in UP, some crime takes place, murder takes place. So, as we understand from law books and as we expect from the state, FIR filing should be a very straightforward matter. There should be a complainant who comes, walks in, and gives a fresh first information report stating that my son or my brother got killed, and I suspect that these fellows are involved. But that's not actually what happens some of the time. Some of the time, FIR, filing of FIR, who is named in FIR, what are the charges brought against him, these all things become a complex interplay of lot of forces, caste-related forces, political forces, money-related considerations. So what this does, at the very first step of law enforcement, it erodes public trust in law enforcement. And once that public trust is eroded, I'll move to my second example. In many cases, when there are murders taking place, the family of the victim does not demand a proper investigation. The family of victims often demand gun licenses. They say, we'll take revenge. No, we don't need your support to avenge the murder of my brother or my son. You just give me a gun license, because with the illicit weapon that I have, the range is nearly 10 feet. But if you give me a proper gun license, I can shoot the person from 30 feet. So what I'm saying is, it's not just capacity building of police, it's also building the trust. And the building of the trust requires greater accountability to the way police and courts function. And if I can continue with that, accountability has to be more decentralized. It is not that we don't have accountability. We have electoral democracy. A democratically elected state government controls police. So we do have very strong accountability mechanisms built in. But somehow, because of UP being a big state, 22 crore people living there, 75 districts, we need more decentralized mechanism for accountability of not just police, but almost every institution of the state, to build greater social trust.
Okay, so one of the things that you pointed at, which kind of comes to the second point of culture. So I guess, given that over the last several decades, we have come across all these scams and that emerged from the region, and dynastic politics that is at play, etc., specific caste-based parties emerging. So there's also this notion that, there's a cultural problem that exists in the region. But if you go back historically, at least, back in 1901, for example, there was no particular difference in literacy rates or, basic measures of culture of sorts, which one could find. For example, I think in southern states often had more stringent caste rules, etc., during that time than the north. So even if there is a cultural problem, even if, say, caste probably has become more important or stringent, this is something that has definitely happened over time when other places might have eroded. So what is your sense on that? And do you see cultural change happening in your own eyes when you are involved in administration?
Actually, we began the discussion with lack of cities in this part of the country compared to the growth of cities in other parts of the country. So actually, according to my understanding, the growth of cities is being hindered. One of the many reasons, of course, this cannot be only reason, is the lack of a strong civic identity. What is happening, the administrative system is held hostage, or should I say, is guided solely by statewide considerations. Whatever happens at Allahabad, whatever happens in Varanasi, it gets seen from the prism of state politics or state level interventions. If we want to develop large cities, we have to create constituencies which have a stake in creation of large cities. And those constituencies which will have stake in creation of large cities will have to be proud of those large cities. A city-wide identity, a strong Allahabad, Prayagraj identity, a strong Varanasi identity, Agra identity, a sort of civic territorial identity compared to this caste or sectarian legacy-based identity. For something like that to be fostered, it cannot be done merely on the basis of political economy based on electoral considerations. Political economy based on electoral considerations can make some improvements, but then there are electoral considerations which circumscribe its innovativeness. I feel, and I may be wrong, I feel that the reason South India has developed much more than North India in the last 50 years or so is because they have very strong tradition of non-electoral social movements. Periyar, going back 150 years or 100 years, we have Mahatma Jyotiba Phule coming in, so Sri Narayan Guru coming in. So what we have movements which were social in character and which were not circumscribed by electoral considerations. Other than that, what has happened in UP and Bihar, the empowerment of weaker sections, the fight against many injustices has been solely through the vehicle of political considerations based on electoral democracy, which has inherent limitations. So I think if you want to create an identity which transcends these narrow sectarian caste identities, we'll have to create more civic identities. And for that to be done, we need social movements of change which go outside the paradigm fixed by electoral democracy.
So one very local level of identity formation started to happen in Indore with the Swachhta Abhiyan, when the city was able to do well relatively to others. And it started to create a stronger sense of Indori identity. So that's an example where, what you're talking about, that a strong Allahabadi identity or a strong Varanasi identity, probably given that many of our cities are not in the best infrastructure kind of conditions. So the pride that is probably needed for building of that common collective identity is also not there. And if in case these kinds of infrastructure development projects that are looking at cities can help, then it can start building those regional identities, etc., etc. So in a separate conversation that I was talking to you, we're talking about the role of universities in building these common identities. Can you say something about that? How can universities, for example, how can IIM Bangalore help in creation of a common identity?
Actually, the discussion that we were having was like, we traditionally have very instrumental view of the value of universities. Universities can be helpful in skilling, giving abilities and skills to negotiate market, to do jobs in the modern economy. But then we are moving beyond that. There was another thing of extremely important value that educational institutions, particularly the institutions of higher education, do. When young boys and girls meet at a good university or a good place like Indian Institute of Management, it's not just that they're getting the skills to be used for negotiating market. There is also exchange of ideas. In most of the time, in a caste-based hierarchical society that we live in, the ideas always intersect with the caste structures. What educational institutions, particularly institutions of higher education, do, they provide platforms. They provide platforms where interchange of ideas takes place outside the limits prescribed by caste-based boundaries. So Allahabad University, different castes mingle. Students of impressionable age from 17 to 25, they come together unconstrained by their parents and elders having very strict caste views. So that exchange of ideas, that exchange of each other's prejudices, that exchange of each other's thoughts, and this is a huge value. So I think if Allahabad University or Banaras Hindu University can develop more organically with the development of that Banarsi identity, BHU, anyway, it has been historically true also. Aligarh Muslim University is part of Aligarh identity. Banaras Hindu University is an integral part of Banarsi identity. That thing needs to be fostered and consciously understood that that Allahabad University doesn't merely train students to go for a job market. Allahabad University also creates a platform where ideas can be exchanged, where views can be exchanged beyond the borders of traditional society. So that's an important thing, according to me.
Now, obviously, these ideas, I mean, the first idea we discussed was this notion of decentralized accountability with police reforms, where society is accountable to the police and the police is accountable to society in some sense.
No, Prateek, I'll interrupt you. Very sorry for that. I just read your article a few days back. You were pitching for a Ministry for Migrant Affairs. Now, that's a very good idea, according to me, which will be relevant in our current context. Now, what happens? Migrants are going back. Now, this plight, that's a humongous human tragedy unfolding, but it is nobody's baby. It is very difficult to pinpoint whose mistake exactly it was. Similarly, you have a pothole in Bahraich Road, or you have a failure of policing in Bada. It's very difficult to pinpoint exactly whose fault it is. Mahatma Gandhi's classic critique against state was that state is way too impersonal, and it's very difficult to find out who was behind Holocaust. Hitler can be conveniently blamed, but the German state becomes a very impersonal machine. So what we need is a decentralized mechanism for accountability, not just for police, but for PWD, for railways. If I'm having problems with railway TT in a particular faraway station in Balia, I should have an immediate report rather than going to all the way to railway board or railway minister. There should be decentralized and empowered mechanisms of accountability available to me. Ombudsman or administrative courts, as we have in France. Something like that. Something like that. Closer. Grievance redressal closer home.
An interesting comment which says that can people's attitude be attributed to the poor entrepreneurial development in these areas in spite of the efforts of the government. So this kind of reminded me that sometimes the police, when we have places where businesses are not very varied and there are not diverse kinds of businesses, what quite often happens is that there is this one big businessman, guy, politician, gunda, all in one. And essentially, the police kind of is forced to work under the thumb of that particular person, whether or they like it or not. And even a bureaucrat coming from a different state has to kind of deal with the power dynamics that are found in these kind of regions, which are lacking in these diverse these diverse businesses. So the moment, it's a chicken and egg problem, that had it been, say, that Allahabad had a diverse set of businesses, then what would have happened is that it would have been a little bit more difficult for the police. The police didn't need to be kind of captured by one particular power source, because there would have been multiple competing power sources within the same place. So the police itself would become a little bit more impartial as an outcome. So so it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem too, that whether police and institutions would give rise to good markets, or vice versa is potentially possible. It's kind of makes it a little complicated. But compared to, for example, the kind of ideas, say, a consultant or a traditional economist will say, which will talk about set up this industry, invest that much in that industry, the kind of ideas that we are ending up discussing are more at the level of governance and identity, which are kind of different. So let me just move ahead to the third bit, which is, so with institutions and culture, we have the third bit, which is essentially, market frictions that exist, lack of information, lack of transportation. And one good thing that has definitely happened in the last 10 years in India and across the country is that the fact that mobile internet has really percolated down. And you right now work in the financial services department. So is it possible that this disruptive technology of mobile, etc., can somehow disrupt the traditional kind of capital provisions, etc., that people have, given that one of the major issues that used to exist is that all the capital is in Bombay, while say there is a business in Allahabad, but the physical distance is so large that it's just not too easy to kind of transfer that capital, because there's a lot of information asymmetry out there. But can this mobile and internet revolution make things better for the region in terms of those market frictions?
Well, I don't know, but if I have to say, the answer can be yes and no in a certain way. Yes, it is. With the kind of information technology revolution we have, and with you can transfer information at the press of a button, monitoring from far away becomes easy. You can access information from sitting anywhere in the world. If there is an opportunity for money to be made in Lucknow or Kanpur, and you are sitting in Chicago or you are sitting in Mumbai, you can always find out that the money to be made there. In certain way, frictions have minimized, information flow has smoothened. But then the problem goes other way around also. We have seen that WhatsApp, while helping us in reaching to faraway places, has also led to what we call, I don't know how do we call it, fake news. A lot of news, a lot of information is no more trustworthy. When economists talked about lack of information being a friction, they actually meant information which was trustworthy. Information inherently meant correct information. Now problem is that we have huge information, but then information is not correct information, or should I say correct information mixed with incorrect information. So what has happened, the digital infrastructure is a secular device, a secular technology that can provide you information but cannot guarantee the correctness of information, or even if the information is correct, cannot guarantee the trust you will have in the correctness of information. So somehow digital infrastructure would help and has been helping us to reduce friction and make it easier for capital to flow in and flow out, and locate opportunities wherever they do exist. But in the end, we will go back to the same place. We cannot wish away the lack of trust in the society. We cannot wish away the fact that our people in Hindi belt, UP, Bihar, somehow are not prepared or have not been made ready for participating in an optimal way in capital in marketplace, and that requires them to reorient their values. Marketplace demands certain values. Marketplace demands certain impersonal, non-tribal values to be had, and those values and this culture of trust, in which you trust the person on his own merits or demerits, not going to his origin, his caste, or things like that. Those are the software of our people, and I'm not blaming them. I'm not blaming. There's no victim blaming going on. What I'm trying to say, that reorientation has to take place, and I don't think electoral democracy can provide complete framework for that reorientation. I will keep going back to the idea that I have, that we need intense social movements outside electoral arena to change the way we think, to change the thought structures that continue to bind us, and that has to take place. If I may, I will recount an anecdote, a personal. About 8 to 9 years earlier, I was talking to Mr. Arvind Kejriwal. At that time, he was not a politician; he was an RTI activist. So we were discussing, and he was saying that I don't believe in electoral democracy, and I think out of electoral democracy, beyond electoral democracy, a social movement has to be carried forward so that citizenry becomes strong. And I kept telling him that electoral democracy is very important. That is the only way you provide legitimacy to your movement. And he was not agreeing. As it happened, he did accept electoral democracy and became one of the most popular chief ministers we have right now, based on the numbers of assembly seats he has won. And I always thought that I have won the argument. I always thought Arvind Kejriwal becoming chief minister is a victory of my argument over his. But over the last 6-8 months, I've been thinking he was correct. He did not realize, he did not go away the way he was saying, but he was actually correct. Once you enter electoral democracy, you are circumscribed by the limits of those electoral democracy. You can be a reformist chief minister, but then there is the electoral cycle. If the election year is approaching, even the most reformist chief minister, being a political animal, has to think of getting re-elected. That is the way political parties function.
We kind of went into like very deep economics, like for which Nobels have not been given yet, which is the role of institutions and culture and identity. But let's go back to the more the consultancy economics, the economics of 30 years old in some sense, which talks about capital, labor, bringing it together, all kind of things that these days the government is trying to do, which is building these really nice SEZs, etc. So one of the very famous examples of SEZ, which is the Pearl River Delta, which is this tiny part of China, which has a GDP close to $2 trillion. And UP's GDP, by the way, is $250 billion. So it's like 8 times more, this tiny region. And obviously it is because of the fact that it's a very investment-friendly region, laws, there's a lot of autonomy, first of all, that is given to the local areas to set their own policies, their future directions, their taxation. And to some extent, Delhi NCR region also is a kind of an SEZ, not an SEZ, but it's an autonomous region which has its own, you talked about decentralized governance. So while what should be the labor law, what should be the taxation limit, these are very specific things that are relevant to a particular industry, and that is why we don't want to kind of in this particular webinar get into the details of it. But broadly speaking, one of the things that is very particular about China or even Pearl River Delta or Delhi is that accountability is still closer. The number of the population that an accountable head is looking after is much smaller than, say, the UP chief minister, who is head of 22 crore people, or Bihar chief minister, who looks at 10 crore people, and Madhya Pradesh has 7 or 8 crore people. So the kinds of populations we are talking about are entire nations, and one person or one administration is accountable for all of it. So let's say that we had to build an SEZ for Allahabad or something. How would a practical governance structure of this exist, given that the person would have to be, first of all, somebody who has to be accountable locally, but then of course he or she is working within the broader framework of the UP government. So how would that kind of a governance structure look like when we want to build these economic clusters?
And I have not had the experience of personally working in the field of special economic zones. Why did they fail in India, or did not succeed to the extent they could have succeeded, as compared to what we see in China? But if I have to structure a special economic zone in Allahabad, and considering the realities as I understand from my limited knowledge, I would think it has to be a collaboration between national and state authorities coupled with the local empowerment, meaning by the SEZ, the broad policies, the kind of labor laws that would be applicable, environmental laws that would be applicable, all those things, capital structures required, all those things can come from, the guidance can come from national or state governments, but the day-to-day running of that special economic zone and its closer hinterland, the greater area beyond special economic zone that will be immediately serving the special economic zone. Like, suppose I want to consider Naini as a special economic zone, I would want Allahabad's governance to be in the hands of a locally democratically elected politician who has a stake in Allahabad's betterment. And when I say he has to take part in that governance, I mean it has to be done in full throttle. Personally, I believe one of the reasons South India did well, one of the many reasons, is that they had more decentralized and empowered district level governance mechanisms. Maharashtra, South India had more. In UP, comparatively, the mayors are not that strong to the local politicians who are directly answerable to. In fact, one of the other things that I think that not only they should be made more powerful, they should have shorter tenure. A mayor need not have same tenure as a prime minister, because the prime minister takes longer gestation period policy decisions that take 3 to 4 years to show results. Where a mayor is in more organic link with his populace, he can show results in 2 or 2.5 years or 3 years, and that person should be empowered. The district magistrate.
Do you think that in that sense that the Delhi NCR region in some sense has basically a chief minister who is responsible for a city? It's a city state, and Sheila Dikshit, Arvind Kejriwal, they have been relatively successful chief minister, probably because they have more manageable states. But if that is the case, why is it even in the case that, Uttar Pradesh and these large states in general have not tried to decentralize themselves? It seems like a very obvious thing. You are trying to manage a giant ship, which is hard to manage, 22 crore people. Why does it remain centralized? Is it just because they want to have like a large, power structure to you? Is that what kind of stops and hinders that decentralization from happening?
It is very difficult to say no to what you propose. But it is very difficult for me to say yes as well. So, of course, history also has a role. Legacy also has a role. You had big states being created at the time of independence, and there's an inertia there. Then there are, of course, issues regarding turf, bigger territory, and things like that. And apart from that, a lesser demand for civic empowerment at the local level. A more enlightened citizenry demanding public goods, local public goods, in a more vocal manner, might have had more empowered local government, and local citizenry demanding local public goods would require loosening of traditional clientelistic platforms on which state functions, a more public good provisioning state rather than a clientelistic state, because a clientelistic state function on a zero-sum argument. locally empowered Allahabad or Varanasi. And one of the most important things is that even when pre-independence, Indian National Congress were trying to build India a nation in the making, one of the most important pillars of nation in the making was very brilliant performance by many municipal heads. Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, if I remember correctly, Siraj Gopalachari also. These were municipal heads. Sardar Patel ran Surat municipality and Nehru ran Allahabad municipality. So somehow local provisioning of local public goods, fostering of local identities, transcending beyond these create demands for decentralization and good governance.
So as you have pointed at, public goods and the fact that if
local
it's
public
a little
goods.
bit, if it's local public goods, they are potentially going to be easier to demand, easier to give. And I think this also brings to this important thing that while we talk about SEZs and institutions and all that, but a very fundamental question does always come up, that should the government spend more, or should the government, lower the taxes? These are the more practical issues that come up when any state is trying to build its policies. And it seems like, when we talk about SEZs, for example, a very simple formula would be that just slash the taxes, let businesses come in and let things go. But obvious worry there is that Dubai, for example, has a similar kind of structure, where basically they are an investment-friendly destination, but essentially it's a very weird zombie economy, which is kind of running on the work and labor of all these migrants coming from poor places. And there is nothing being offered to them. So they come, they stay for a while, they go back, and there's a serving upper class that gets served. So just providing, as you point out, the role of public goods, developing SEZs would be great. If in case some sort of kind of a public good can be provided. And in that sense, South India and recently Bangladesh has been doing pretty well, given that both of them have understood that they have to become self-reliant. They have to build these economic clusters. So while South India focused on manufacturing, IT, agri-processing, Cyberabad and all that stuff, the money that was being raised by them was ultimately going in health and education and giving credit to people. And sometimes when we talk about economic policies and et cetera, this particular link gets forgotten. That is a very critical link, because until and unless that happens, the people who should be the beneficiaries of it, just by being part of factories, they're not going to become prosperous. They'll become members of a sweatshop. And this investment, this parallel investment, becomes very important. And in that front, UP and Bihar and Jharkhand and Madhya Pradesh, all of them have been very terrible. School dropout rates still continue to be very, very high. And there seems to be a kind of a vicious circle, that had it been so that there were cities, there were economic centers, there were also wide rates of jobs, in that situation, it would have possibly happened that the region, also people had to also send their kids to school. So this linkage between sending children to school is also dependent on what kind of market opportunities they have. So that's something I thought kind of comes into play. And recently Bangladesh has been doing the same thing. It has focused on a textile cluster. It's not a resource-rich state. So I saw some of the comments there which talked about we should build mineral zones. I mean, if a state has minerals, that's great, but there's no, historically speaking, it is not the case that only mineral-rich states, countries have been rich. It is ultimately human capital which drives development. And for example, the recent, given that you were the DM of, and you must have been involved with these developmental programs, what were some of the difficulties that you used to face when it comes to offering, doing these kinds of social public good generation kind of work?
Actually, personally believing, as my experience has taught me, social interventions in the form of nutrition support, education, and health have huge impact on society that we live in, and it also prepares a launching pad for economic development. My reading of China, the special economic zone, as you were showing, I was thinking, my reading of Chinese growth is very simple, and as all simple explanations are incomplete. It is incomplete, but it's very simple. What I believe is by 1980, as late as 1990, India and China almost had the same per capita income. If I am correctly, 1990, they had same per capita income. But around 1980, as early as 1980, China was providing almost universal public health facilities and public education at the primary level, almost near universalization, something which we have not been able to do 40 years later. As you said, the most important resource is the human resource. South India developing faster than North India, or China developing faster than India, is a function of many things. But the most important thing that comes to me, based on my training and education, whatever, or my experiences, is that intervention in nutrition, primary health, and primary education. Now, what has happened in last 30, 40 years or so, UP in particular has failed to appreciate the importance of these soft interventions. Anganwadi used to be a very low priority. Anganwadi is nutrition support for early childhood care, pre-primary school kids. Now, Anganwadi is should be one of the most important pillars of state intervention for poverty alleviation. But I can tell you from my experience, it is not the most glamorous part of what a district magistrate is supposed to do. It has horrible consequences. If you do not invest sufficient amount of political capital, or if you do not invest sufficient administrative attention to something as important as Anganwadi, early childhood care, you are dooming the next generation to come. You are dooming the future of Uttar Pradesh for next 20 years down the line.
That's really interesting that you point out, because when it comes to Bangladesh, one of the things that has often, been highlighted is that Bangladesh, which was a very, very poor state, it used to get all this money as foreign aid. People of Hindi Heartland would not really look at Bangladesh for inspiration. Today, Bangladesh is having its per capita income almost close to India, when the Hindi Heartland states are very low. And one of the reasons that it has done so is that its more prominent aspect was that it was focusing on women a lot, as you're talking about Anganwadi, for example, and empowering the women is kind of being their main point, where they empowered the women, and then those women started to work in these economic clusters, these textile industries, and now they are like the main textile hub. So it's a very different way of thinking at things that prioritize Anganwadi over. I'm pretty sure you're not saying that we should prioritize them over SCZs, but they're kind of equally important, even though, as you point out, that Anganwadis don't sound as the most, if a consultant has to give a presentation on economic growth, they are probably not going to put Anganwadi as the number one suggestion, but probably that is one of the most important and top suggestions that ultimately needs to go.
Prateek, yeah. I'll tell you something. Once I was a sub-division magistrate and I was visiting a village with my DM. My district magistrate was a nice man, a very sensitive man regarding women empowerment, as all of us should be. And he understood the correctness of the problem that unless we empower women folk to become independent members of society, it's very difficult for us to move forward. He asked something about, I don't remember exactly, but he asked something about, I don't know, was it a contraceptive doses to be taken by women or some injections to be taken by expectant mothers, something like that. He asked in the front of a lot of assembly of villagers. And there was, across the board, the male response was, they were giggling and they were saying, this is something for women to answer, women don't care about it. Then he asked one particular fellow, is your wife expecting? He said, yeah, it's expecting. He said, which month is it? And what is she having, whether she's seeing an ASHA worker or something like that. And that fellow laughed back at the DM and said, these things men are not supposed to know. Go and ask my wife. So this is the culture that we have in society, which of course gets filtered down to our political priorities. And as I said, that gets also filtered down to our administrative attention. So if you are a consultant presenting to Chief Minister UP or Prime Minister of India, of course, Anganwadi, early childhood care, maternal care, these are sine qua non for any industrial development, in SEZ or no SEZ, you are not going to have, because we don't prepare the launch pad. Who are going to work in SEZ? Stunted population with low abilities of physical or mental abilities won't work. If we are facing huge human tragedy in migrant movement, that cannot be solved by any interventions we make in next 6 months. That can only be solved by interventions that we have a time horizon of next 10 to 20 years. and primary education, early childhood care, nutrition support are the most, including express policies for women empowerment, are the most important part of the interventions that we can do.
So let me
At least in my
move
book.
on.
At least in my book.
So let me move on to the last part, which is execution. So we covered it to some extent, that what kind of accountability systems that we should have in place, and decentralized accountability of a range of systems came into place. So this was something some of us from IIMB had studied Kumbh last year, and some of the things that I personally kind of found to be very interesting was that it is a huge event, and it's very hard to manage. 3-4 crore people come on a single day in Kumbh, and it's effectively a city. Everybody's health, everybody's all sorts of requirements are being taken care of, and it's sometimes astonishing because we associate poor governance with the Hindi heartland. But at the same time, it is capable of executing such extremely polished events over time. And what was very particular about it was that one of the most important things that came out was that the region had, the Kumbh has a very clear accountability. There's a person whose head is on the line if something goes wrong. And that kind of an accountability plays a big role. And ultimately, if something is not working right, people know whom to finally go to. And that is not the chief minister at the top of it, because it's hard. The chief minister of 22 crore people has many other things to care about. So there's a person at the local level, and that is not the case for our SEZs or for our economic clusters. So that is one thing which probably can help. They have clearer missions, focused and decentralized governance. They talk a lot to the Juna akhadas and all the different akhadas. They engage in conversation with them as a collective effort with one clear leader from the bureaucracy. Now, given this situation, so given that now we are in a COVID kind of COVID reality where we want to boost investments, so does it mean that the summary that we are getting in the end is that, along with all these labor reforms and capital reforms and so forth, a more fundamental thing that needs to happen is probably governance reform? Is that kind of a key message here in this conversation that we're having, that governance and how we go about doing these things and governing our states also needs to have a change, and we need to start thinking whether, who should be leading these initiatives, who should be making these critical decisions of what level of labor reform should happen and so forth. Is that the kind of, the emerging summary here?
Yeah, greater clarity in the roles and proper mapping of accountability with authority. Most of the time, government authority and accountability gets split up. Somebody has the real authority, somebody is supposed to become accountable. So, of course, better mapping of accountability with authority, clearer demarcation of who is responsible and who is not responsible for which particular step in the entire chain will definitely help. But Prateek, I'll go back to the point I was saying, look here, we have almost the same constitutional system working South India as well as in North India. We have same civil service bureaucracy, almost the same top bureaucracy, Indian administrative service, Indian police service officials working in the states. Most of them are transferable across, sometimes at times get transferred to across the states also. So yeah, we have what we call the rudimentary hardware of governance is common across the state. Same governor sitting as constitutional head of the state, same legislature, same Vidhan Sabha. But when it actually goes to the level of implementation, the governance at the cutting edge, not the governance as in the books, not the governance as mandated, but when the governance actually goes to the governance and the governed meet in a transactional way. When my sub-inspector goes and meets the shopkeeper and asks about his welfare or seeks money from him, when my patwari goes to meet the kisan, at that level, situation is different. And if we want immediate attention for economic growth in post-COVID scenario when migrants have returned, some immediate quick fixes would be required. And that would mean clearer demarcation of accountability and authority. Yeah, with greater decentralization.
We are almost short on time now. So what I'll do is that we will, those who want to leave, they can leave, but I'll now request we can take some questions, like 2 or 3 questions from the panel. So if you have any questions, you can just type them in and then I'll take them. both of us can take them. Anyone in the public? It would be better if you don't. Could you type your question? Okay, so a question being asked is, how suitable is Hindi belt for industrialization? Well, that's a strange question because, I mean, all regions are good for industrialization. There is no particular reason to believe that a particular region is less or more suitable for industrialization, because Japan was suitable for industrialization, even if it didn't have many resources. So ultimately, it is what is in people's heads which determines what is good for industrialization. So one question is, what about the role of bureaucrats in bringing about change? So do you think, Alok, that there is need for bureaucrats to change in some ways for change to be brought about? You are not, you're muted. I'll just unmute you. Yeah.
There is a huge amount of change required at all levels, bureaucracy included. But we have to understand bureaucracy like any other institution reacts to the reality in which they live in. So if the demand side demands change, when the political system demands change, bureaucrats change. When bureaucrats, they are same bureaucrats, same examination, same qualification. They are working in Tamil Nadu, Kerala, as well in UP and Bihar. So bureaucrats leave a lot to be desired, as most of other institutions of the society leave a lot to be desired. And when society change, bureaucrats change. And the last question that you had was is UP suitable for industrialization?
Hindi Heartland suitable for industrialization.
If you read books in which were published in 1950s, 60s, 40s, they have most of the books had a common thesis that China is not suitable for industrialization. So Chinese way of life is laid back, very easy, lazy life, and Chinese are not good for industrialization. This is what we had books written in 1940s, very well educated people writing like that. Almost all countries in the world, all places in the world are suitable for being rich, for leading a nice and decent life.
So what are the short-term solutions for the migrants who are moving back? So that's a question that emerges, that industrialization and some of these ideas that we should build a common identity, et cetera, these are very long-term solutions. What about the short-term things that we need to do immediately? Any thoughts on that?
CMI just published a report saying that a third of Indian households have just a week money left for consumption. So it's a very horrible position, a very difficult situation that we are in. Immediate consumption support is required. And we are moving in that direction. Ration is being provided. And we need to go further than that. In the long term, we are all dead. So long-term things are important. But immediate short-term consumption support measures should be taken up as we do in a crisis situation. It's a consumption crisis we are facing, which will have huge human implications. We need to provide consumption support immediately and on a massive scale.
So one question is emerging, and I think which is, when I was a kid, that is what I thought, that we have had very bad leaders. That is what I used to often think has been the main problem historically. But do you think that is true, that we have been unlucky with leadership? Or is it just that we had some cultural cliffs, cleavages inside our society, which gives rise to particular kind of politics? Or is it that if we were replaced by a very good leader who was very visionary, that would fix things? Have you felt like when you worked that, gosh, I just wish I had a better leader to work?
The part of growing up is moving from a binary to continuum. So when you are a child, you are a binary between good and bad. When you grow up, you realize nobody is good enough, nobody is bad enough. So part of growing up is moving from binary of good and bad. My kids keep on asking, is he good or is he bad? Very difficult to answer. Is Japan good or bad? Is Germany a good country or bad? Pakistan a good country or bad? So part of growing up is realizing that it's a continuum. Very difficult to place people in good or bad buckets, leaders included. But yeah, we have been lucky. I think broadly, we have not been very unlucky with our leaders. Broadly speaking, we have not been very unlucky with our leaders.
Okay. So any parting last thoughts that you would like to share on the issue?
Hey, firstly, this webinar has been a learning experience for me, and I said many things which I'm not sure whether they have any strong basis in the theoretical economics paradigm or not. But this is what came to me as a native from Allahabad, as a person who has lived there and also worked there for some time. But in the context of COVID-19, all the talk about long-term industrialization or interventions in medium term are important, but the governments and the administration should go back to drawing board for immediate short-term measures. This is the moment where short-term must take precedence over long-term and medium term. It is a crisis where medium-term or long-term reforms should take place, and they are taking place, but short-term measures should be given attention they deserve. Unless we are going to throw on a whole lot of humanity to perils of starvation.
Thanks a lot. So I had similar thoughts that I think even when we talk about the crisis right now, one of the things that happens is that we are treating poor people like bodies, like, you know, workers. So we mention them as workers and migrants, but we don't treat them as, or mention them as as human beings, or think about their full humanity. But ultimately, when it comes to poverty of a region, it is human beings who are poor. And until and unless we start to treat them as full human beings, and you start realizing then giving just a small amount of grain and some shelter, that's not the way to restart the economy, unless we provide them full human dignity that they have and think of them in that manner. Obviously, we have 44 labor codes, if I'm not wrong, which should be simplified clearly. A lot of questions about labor reforms, but obviously that all of that is good and fine only if we have public goods being generated. We have short-term support being provided to people on this front, and probably then we can do something. But thanks a lot. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
At the peak about 120 people, and that was great. And there were people from 80 cities and 8 different countries. That is what the registration information said. So webinar is making it possible for these conversations to happen at a very broad level. So thanks everyone for joining. We will record this and we will be sharing it with you in some time. Thanks a lot.